When you set up an institution, or have a child, or get a pet, very often you have an idea of what you're going to end up with. But the reality is that you set a process in motion that may very well end up with an animal that looks very different from the one that you intended. And so it is time now to make an assessment of whether the animal that was set up in 1976, when the NHT was created by an act of parliament, an act that amended the National Insurance Act, really looks like the animal that either that the founders had in mind or that we have in mind for what an institution like the NHT should be doing. We're going to look at what this animal has grown into, what this baby elephant has grown into. We can motivate or understand the purpose of this exercise with a statement that was made a few years ago. The original purpose of the NHT was to provide homes for those who needed help to acquire a home. It has failed in that respect. It has failed in that respect. And we need to fix it. This statement was made by the then chairman of the NHT, Howard Mitchell. This report is acting upon that statement and its implications. The presentation is divided into 3 sections. First, we're going to make an assessment of the funding and how adequate or excessive it is for the activities that the NHT has been carrying out. Then we're going to look at who is actually getting the benefit of what the NHT is doing. And then finally, following from looking at who benefits, we're going to see if the strategy that the NHT is using to pursue its goals is the right strategy. So let's start off first by looking at the funding. Well, where does it come from? The NHT is funded primarily by employees contributing 2% of their wages to a refundable trust, and employers contributing 3% of the wage bill, non-refundable. This is effectively a 5% tax on formal employment. That's a big tax. To see what the effect of all of this is financially, we're going to look at the NHT's income statement for the last fiscal year that's available, for 2015. I've aggregated it a bit to keep it simple. On the income side, it consists of employer contributions of $13 billion, rounded, interest and investment income of about $10 billion, and then miscellaneous revenue of about $2 billion, to give a total revenue of 25 billion Jamaican dollars. On the expenditure side, dollars of operating expenses and various advances and losses accounting to about $3 billion, for a total expenditure of $7 billion. This means that the National Housing Trust annually has an operating surplus of $18 billion. If you think that sounds like a lot of money, there's more. If you look at the other part of the financial information, if you look at the balance sheet, this is where the employee's contribution goes, because it's really a loan by the employees to the NHT. It's refundable. So last year, the balance sheet reflected refundable employee contributions of $82 billion. But if you look at the balance sheet for the previous year, that item was $76 billion. So it grew by $6 billion from one year to the next. This is refundable. But it turns out that not many of the contributors actually apply for the refund. If you look through the previous financial statements, you will see that only about 12 or 13% of the contributors regularly apply for the refund. So last year, for example, only $1 billion of employee contributions was refunded, which means this item grew by $6 billion. Only $1 billion was refunded. So that ended up being a contribution to the NHT's investable surplus of $5 billion a year. So if we add that $5 billion to the $18 billion, it means that the NHT is accumulating surplus at the rate of approximately $23 billion a year. Now, it does raise the question, at a time when the government has been struggling to maintain fiscal prudence, to hit a primary surplus target, and at a time when the households that are contributing are also trying to balance their budgets and meet more pressing needs for feeding the family that evening or paying for school lunch the next day, why is it this public institution is accumulating money at the rate of $23 billion a year? As a result of this surplus year after year, the NHT's capital plus refundable contributions available for investment keeps growing year after year. 10 years ago, it was about $75 billion. It has now grown to roughly $200 billion. And if anything, this understates the rate at which it accumulates. For one thing, the government owes it about $60 billion in employer contribution that it has not paid over. For another, the NHT keeps using this surplus for non-housing related expenses. So now it has accumulated to $200 billion. 200 billion Jamaican dollars is a mountain of cash. Now, one thing I know is that it's hard for me to wrap my mind around $200 billion. These very large amounts of money. How is $200 billion different from 10 million? It's just a big number. So I try to kind of understand, how much is this really? What could this do? $200 billion could buy 1/5 of the land in Kingston. I looked at the market capitalization of some publicly traded companies and discovered that $200 billion could buy the market capitalization of the RGR Group after the Gleaner merger. It could buy all of Lasco. It could buy all of Grace Kennedy. It could buy all of Pan Jamaican, the property company. It could buy Sagicor. The NHT surplus could buy Carib Cement. It could buy Corp. These are not choices, It could buy all of these at the same time and take it home. This is a lot of money. There are approximately somewhat less than 400,000 PATH beneficiaries. Some of them live in the same household, so that's somewhat less than 100,000 households that various members receive benefits in the PATH program. If we took the poorest half, could provide all of them, all 40,000 of them, with a house for free. is why we see from time to time, I mean, it makes sense now, that the NHT very often gets involved in spending money, including Emancipation Park. And many, 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 many other activities. It just has a lot of money. So we did an experiment. We did a simulation. We looked at its the financial statements going forward. Suppose we reduced drastically the funding to the NHT. Suppose, for example, that we eliminated entirely the employer's contribution of 3%. And then just roll the financial statements going forward on the assumption that the NHT continued doing exactly the activities it has been doing up to now to the same extent. What happens to its accumulated capital and refundable contributions available for investment? It keeps on growing. It could exist only under refundable employee contributions. In another 10 years, it would have well in excess of $300 billion. It seems to have too much money. So, in terms of the adequacy of the funding, that's our conclusion. Then we turned our attention to, okay, well, this thing is costly. It is, usurping a large amount of the country's economic resources. But at least it is for a good cause. We turn our attention to who is benefiting from what the NHT does. Well, I'd actually like to ask, what is the purpose of the NHT? Can somebody tell me? Can somebody just volunteer what you think is the purpose of the NHT? Huh? To provide housing for whom? Huh? For the needy. To provide housing for the needy. Is that what you think? Everybody seems to think that the NHT is to provide housing for the needy. We look back at an early study by M.M. Smith, looking at the period of the 1970s when the NHT was set up. And it said that the NHT is the most far-reaching and fundamental policy of social change. Now, there was a lot of positive social change in the 1970s. And in that mix, the NHT was supposed to have been the most far-reaching policy of social change attempted by the Manley government. It's a big claim. Let us go from 1976 to 40 years later. The JLP manifesto, the successful manifesto, as it turns out, said that the NHT will work solely for the intended purpose of financing homes for low-income contributors. That is the intended purpose. At least that's what the JLP thinks, in accordance with many of you. And a more contemporary analysis that came from a book that looked at the issue across the Caribbean claimed that the NHT should be correcting for the failures of capitalism by extracting social surplus from the middle class and above and redistribute it to the poor. Well, if you think that the NHT is extracting surplus from the middle class and above and redistributing it to the poor, we have news for you. Here's what we found. We started by looking at previous studies of the NHT. And there were a couple of them done all the way back in the 1990s. And those studies came to the conclusion, back in the 1990s, that the top 1% of contributors was getting as much of the benefit as the bottom 60% of contributors. We set about trying to examine whether that skewed result still obtained in the 2010s, in more recent years. When we looked at the number of mortgage beneficiaries by income group, we divided the contributors into roughly equal groups. Those earning less than $10,000 a week, those between $10,000 a week and $20,000 a week, and those earning more than $20,000 a week. We discovered that the poorest group received only 23% of the mortgages. And the wealthiest third were receiving 48% of the mortgages. The benefits are largely going to the wealthiest third. And that's number of mortgages. When we did the same analysis by the value of mortgages, the skew was greater. The poorest third receiving only 15% of the value of mortgages, the wealthiest third, 57%. This is looking at the allocation of mortgages over the last 7 years. Of more than 500,000 contributors, 60% are in the poorest group. And more than 3/4 of them do not receive any benefit. This was not our conclusion. This was not part of our study. This is a statement by the then chairman of the NHT. It seems that previous chairman of the NHT and CaPRI and the previous studies are aligned on the conclusion that it is not indeed benefiting the neediest contributors. It is benefiting the wealthiest contributors. One of the studies that we looked at concluded that the disbursement of NHT mortgages is skewed to higher income earners. So, we did a final analysis. Another way of trying to see who's paying and who's benefiting. We calculated the average household income of contributors and compared it to the average household income of the beneficiaries. And realized that the average household income of contributors is less than the average household income of the beneficiaries. The poorer contributors are contributing to the benefit of the wealthier ones. So we took this finding, wrote the report, and we sent it to the NHT for their comment. And the NHT scrutinized the report and gave us some quite useful feedback, pointed out where we had made some errors. But in terms of our claim that the NHT is not carrying out its mandate, we call it, to help the neediest contributors, their response is, this is incorrect. Not that they are not carrying out that mandate. No, what we are incorrect about is that that is not their mandate at all. That they are there to provide housing for all of their contributors. And they are not, in fact, geared to trying to help the neediest ones. That is not part of the way that they were constituted. Well, that turns out to be true. But it was news to us. And apparently it's news to you. I'll tell you something else. I went to the NHT's website, and it seems to be news as well to the people who wrote the text on the website. Because it does have a line that says, it is to provide financial assistance to the most needy of our contributors. It seems, based on the data that we have gathered, that the NHT is a tax on the poorest contributors used to subsidize the wealthier ones. Why is this happening? Why is the strategy not delivering on what everyone thinks is its purpose, and which, if you look at budget presentations year after year after year, all references to the NHT are motivated by this idea that it's a welfare program, that it is part of our welfare state to help the neediest. So why is it not, in fact, doing that? So we looked at the NHT strategy. Its primary interventions are, well, on the supply side, it finances developers, it gives loans to developers, and it builds its own housing. The NHT is not a minor or supplemental player in the housing market. If you look at housing construction over the last 15 years, you will see that public housing constructed by public agencies, of which the NHT is by far the largest, dominates the housing market. The NHT is the elephant, grown now, in the housing sector. Well, one consequence of this is that public housing is crowding out the private provision of houses. It discourages private investors from going into the business of competing against the subsidized government agency. Then, on the demand side, it subsidizes mortgages, which is the activity of the NHT that we are all familiar with. And technically, the agency's executives who responded to us are right. The NHT, in its constitution, is equally obligated to all of its contributors. Therein lies the problem. Now, to be fair to the NHT, and the NHT was correct to point this out in their response to us, they have many other programs that are designed specifically to help the neediest and the poorest. They have a handful of them. The two most well-known are the service lots program, where you can actually get an NHT loan not to buy a house, but to just buy a land as long as the land is ready for building. It is serviced with utilities and access and sewage. And there's a Starter Plus program as well, which is also geared to the neediest contributors. So there are programs, but the programs are not sufficient to shift the weight of the benefit of the NHT overall to the neediest contributors. When we accumulate what the NHT does, most of its beneficiaries are the wealthier amongst its contributors. If we are going to start to think about a different strategy, a different way to organize the NHT, the first realization, one starting point, is to recognize that the poorest in the society are not like the wealthiest, but just with less money. The reason that people end up being poor is because they have characteristics that are different from the wealthiest. One of the most glaring ones that we discovered is that the poor have sporadic and insecure income. And if you have sporadic and insecure income, the sensible thing for you to do is not to sign a contract for a fixed payment every single month for 30 years. You don't know whether you're going to have income year after next June. Because it's the nature of your income, and has been the nature of your income, that sometimes you have it, sometimes you don't. So you don't even apply for the mortgage. This calls for more flexible and responsive payment schemes that can be consistent with the inconsistency of the income streams. Part of our exercise was to sort of canvass housing agencies in the broader Latin American and Caribbean region to see what they do. And one of our discoveries is that it is only the relatively wealthy, relatively now, who start to think about owning a house as their next priority. The poorest amongst us are really much more concerned with more immediate needs. So by focusing on owning a house, by design, you're eliminating satisfying the needs of the neediest persons in the society. The neediest persons in the society really have no choice, don't want to tie up capital in ownership, really have no choice but to partake in the rental market. And many of the best functioning agencies, therefore, intervene in the rental market to make it more efficient, to make it more accessible to the truly needy. In Jamaica, we need to look at that too. I want to conclude by quoting from the report that we're launching this evening. It says the NHT should focus on providing solutions, not houses, and only for those who are too poor to participate effectively in the housing market otherwise. That should be its focus, and that should be its mission. We draw the conclusion that the NHT has too much money. It's helping the wrong segment of society in the wrong way. The report contains a number of specific recommendations. Some of those recommendations require doing less than it has been doing before. Maybe eliminating some of the contributions, and perhaps instead transferring that to the consolidated fund, or better still, leaving it in people's pockets. It is to be prevented from engaging in expenditures that are outside of its mandate. That it should be intervening and subsidizing the demand side of the market and not the supply side. And that perhaps it should get out of the business entirely of competing with the private sector in the provision of housing. In other areas, our recommendations are to do more than it has been doing, to facilitate incremental building, reflecting the insecure and sporadic nature of the income of the poorest. To also, because of that reason, find ways to facilitate flexible repayment schemes that can be put on moratorium when income is lower than expected. Outside of the NHT, the best thing we can do for the housing market to make it more efficient and to make it cheaper, to make cheaper housing available, is to speed up the approval of construction projects. And finally, all subsidized benefits should be reserved for the poorest segment of the population. But I think that will allow us to massage the NHT into a more effective institution. I do think that the report that we have done raises larger questions. And larger questions need to be dealt with perhaps in a more fundamental way. We leave that for your judgment. Thank you very much.